It's just who we are, mate. It's just who we are.
Ange Postecoglou, Nottingham Forest's new manager. The third different manager we've had in the Premier League era, and the 8th different manager under Evangelos Martinakis. He is somebody that should be very familiar to all of us having watched the Premier League the last 2 seasons. He has gained a lot of attention, mainly for the way he plays his football. In 2 seasons with Spurs, he guided them to their first trophy in 17 years, winning the Europa League last season, a competition that we're going to be playing in this season. But he also, in the same season, guided Spurs to their lowest ever Premier League finish, coming 17th with the 5th worst defensive record in the league. Was that just a separate individual situation at Spurs, or will it happen again? Is this something we should be concerned about? Will this be a success, or will it just end in tears? Let's talk about it in this video. Why have Nottingham Forest appointed Ange Postecoglou? Before we get into what he's like as a manager and what we can expect from Ange Postecoglou at Nottingham Forest, let's briefly go over his background. He has certainly got a lot to prove at this level in England, but overseas you can't really argue at all with his pedigree. Having played all of his playing career at South Melbourne Hellas, he played nearly 200 times for the club as a defender, which is interesting because him as a manager, his entire tactical setup kind of neglects defending. 3 years after leaving them as a player, he'd rejoin them as a manager and would win 3 trophies with the club. Following this, he'd managed Australia at under 17 and under 20 level for 7 years, when in 2009, he'd then joined Brisbane Roar. In 2.5 years of Brisbane Roar, he'd go 36 games unbeaten with the club and guide them to 2 back-to-back A-League titles, the first time a club had ever done that at the time. Having then spent a year with Melbourne Victory, he would take over as the Australian national team manager in 2013, probably the peak of his career. For the fact that he's managing Australia, that is, because he guided them to 2 World Cups, managing them at the 2014 World Cup, losing all 3 games, but it was a very tough group. He also guided Australia to their first ever RFC Asian Cup title by beating South Korea in 2015 and qualified them to the 2018 World Cup. Not long after doing this, he'd leave and he'd go to Japan to take over at Yokohama Marinos. I've probably said that slightly wrong, but now managing in Japan, he'd guide them as well to a league title. Interestingly enough, in his 2nd season, he won a trophy.
I don't usually win things, I always win things in my 2nd year.
Winning Yokohama their first J-League title in 15 years. At this stage, we're getting more familiar with Ange because in 2021, he joined Celtic and spends 2 seasons with the club, winning back-to-back SPL titles, and in his 2nd season, winning the domestic treble. He was even nominated for the FIFA World Coach of the Year because of these achievements. And you could say, well, it's nothing, he's only managing in Scotland and Australia and Japan. He's not done it at a big club yet. Well, he'd finally get the chance to manage in a Big 5 league and would become the first Australian Greek manager to manage in the Premier League when he joined Spurs in June 2023. This is where he'd get off to an unbelievable start at Tottenham, winning 8 of the first 10 games in charge of Spurs, and they genuinely looked like early title contenders in those early rounds of the season. He won the first 3 Manager of the Month awards, so that's how good they were. But it would end up getting found out and it would end up taking its toll on the squad. Because in a game against Chelsea, when they would lose 4-1 at home, because of how Ange tends to play his football, 2 players being sent off, and Ange wouldn't, maybe just tighten things up. And I mean, you're down to 9 men at this stage. You surely want every single member of your team back. You ideally want to bring your entire bench on at that stage. Not that that's possible. And yet Ange continued to still play a very open attacking style of football, but particularly concerning was such a high line. This photo you can see now is when they were drawing, and because of this photo they end up losing the game 4-1, and from this point onwards they have a bit of a blip, they end up picking up, and it never really gets going again like it did before, because at this stage they also had long-term injuries starting to happen. They had a lot of teams figuring out how Ange plays. There was clearly room for improvement. There was a clear philosophy there, but one that was definitely up for debate whether it was actually working or not. In his second season, it became even more apparent why he was basically permanently in an injury crisis, because the way Ange plays his football, it does put a lot of pressure on the players. We'll talk about that more later on. But from the get-go in the league last season, they never really looked like being a threat and would end up regressing to mid-table to the point where they'd end up basically just giving up on the league and would focus absolutely everything into the Europa League, especially once they were out of the FA Cup. Maybe that's why they came so low, because they just basically weren't even really trying in the league by the end. Maybe if they were, it would have been slightly better, but still very concerning for Tottenham level. But in the Europa League, you did see Spurs play some very good football because they were actually trying, I guess. And even though they had quite a decent route to the final and then having to play an equally as bad side in Man United in the final, they won the Europa League and they did pretty well to do so. Ultimately, the league season was too much and Ange would be fired. But he was very well respected and very well loved by Spurs fans. Even those that didn't really like him, they could at least respect him. Most of them could anyway. But let's actually talk in more detail about his approach. I've already touched on it there. You know, a very high line, a risky system, putting a lot of strain on players. And that really is the essence of it. He doesn't really like to have much defensive structure, or at least the system that he plays, it doesn't really allow for it. Ange typically played 4-3-3 or 4-2-3-1 with Spurs in both his seasons there, and the entire time opted for a very attacking approach, which I don't think can be criticised. We want to see attacking football. We saw Chris Hughton. I'd absolutely take attacking football in a heartbeat having watched that. However, the way in which we go about it with Ange, that's what concerns me a bit, because with Spurs, you saw how that team got decimated with injuries because of how much running, how much work they had to put in, how much strain they had to put on their bodies, because they were playing a high line. And whenever they got caught out, it meant an awful lot of running for the defenders, therefore leaving themselves wide open, possibly getting red cards, and then just tying themselves out, making the risk of injury be a lot higher. There was a period last season where they were playing a young Archie Gray in his first season in the Premier League, who is actually a midfielder at centre-back. He played at the City Ground in that game as a centre-back because they had nobody else, and then Draggers in, who was definitely not first choice, playing next to him because Van de Ven and Romero were both injured. So it's not just an attacking style, but everybody being so far forward. That photo against Chelsea, everybody on the halfway line. That might be quite an extreme example, but Spurs often did do that. And in the Europa League, they actually were a bit more pragmatic. They were able to adapt a bit more. And maybe that is what happens when you do actually go all out and try and win it. Maybe in the league, it wasn't so much a priority to go and win those games because it was over. When he put all his eggs into the Europa League basket, it would work. And in his first season, ultimately they did come fifth by playing a similar style when they didn't have the distraction of Europe. But ultimately Forest are going to have that distraction, and he's got to be able to balance the two. And if particularly you look at how it compares to how he played in Nuno, this is the biggest talking point, I think, is the difference in style we are going to see here between Ange and Nuno. Nuno, last season, we saw how Forest played. Very attacking at times, but often just sitting back and soaking up pressure. We had the third least possession in the Premier League last season, having 40.8% of the ball on average. That actually feels quite polite, to be honest. And it worked well most of the time, but we definitely needed to learn to adapt. Then obviously counter-attacking and pressing a lot. That was how Forest played. And it was exciting, but we had to be turgid at times as well to grind games out. If we think that Nuno didn't have a plan B, then I don't know what we're going to think to Ange, because he is well known for not having a plan B. However, even in the Nuno at the start of this season, we have seen a bit of a change. We've had a bit more of the ball. We've gone from having the third least possession in the league to the fifth most in the first 3 games. Having 17% more of the ball on average than what we had last season. and that's only in 3 games. So maybe this actually will suit the transition to Postecoglou's style, because Ange typically did have a bit more of the ball than what we did last season. It wasn't much, and having looked through every game last season, it really was very all over the place. It was never really a continuous thing. If you look at it, there were some games where Spurs had 32% of the ball, there was others where they had 80. On average though, it was more than what we had. So last season is going to be the concern, but ultimately in his first season, it did go pretty well. Having had a great start, came 5th, even if it did tumble off, not taking into account the injuries and then getting found out, it was probably quite a good season overall. But last season, that's why people are going to judge him, and the fact that ultimately, besides his 2 years with Spurs, he's not managed at the highest of levels. Besides obviously going to the World Cup, but even so, there's a reason that people are sceptical about this. I'm sceptical about it. But at the same time, I like Ange a lot as a person. I think he's a good manager. I think he's proven himself around the world, but there's a lot that he needs to prove at this level. In his first interview with Forest, it's only a brief clip that I've seen, he says, you know, people criticise me, they say that this is only one way of playing, but it's just my way of making sure we win football matches, and I like that, but you know, I just think you've got to be able to adapt a bit more. But what do you think, everybody? Let me know in the comments what you think of this appointment. Is Ange the right man for you? Do you think it's going to work at Forest? Do you think it's really not going to work? Let me know in the comments. We've now got to get to know a lot of new players that still haven't even played for Forest yet, as well as a new manager. It's made this season even more hectic and special, hopefully, than what it was already going to be. Thank you for watching this video, everyone. This was how Ange Postecoglou might set up and how it might go for him at Nottingham Forest. Let's wait and see. Let's get behind him. Hope you've enjoyed this. Like, subscribe to Rads if you're new. And up the Reds.